Hi, everyone. Welcome to a special Charlie Parker Memorial broadcast, a birthday broadcast. Today is the 100th anniversary of Charlie Parker's birth, and I've got a couple of Charlie Parker enthusiasts here. We're going to talk about the life and music of Charlie Parker, and Chuck Haddix has written a book called Bird, The Life and Music of Charlie Parker. And Bobby Watson is an alto player who is somewhat of a musical follower of Charlie Parker. So I want to welcome my two guests here, and let's start out with Bobby. Bobby, when did you first hear, when were you first conscious of Charlie Parker?
Oh, it was around 11th grade in high school. My American history teacher was a jazz drummer at night, and he turned the second half of the year into jazz history, and bought the books and handed them out to the class and taught the jazz history from the beginning up until the present time, which was 1970. And he played all kinds of records, and when he played Charlie Parker, my life was immediately illuminated and changed, inspired. I went to the record store for the first time in my life, to a record store, and I went in there to buy some Charlie Parker. So he really started me on the path. You know, I got the bug.
Yeah. Same question, Chuck. How did you first hear about Bird?
Well, growing up in Kansas City, you always heard about Charlie Parker because he's such a local legend. The first time I heard his music, I was shopping for records in a cutout bin at UMKC in the bookstore. And I came across the Charlie Parker record, and I'd heard about Charlie, but I'd never heard him. I took it home and listened to it, and at first I didn't get it. It took me a while to understand and appreciate Bird. Where I really began to know Bird, though, was during the early 1970s when I started hanging out on the scene with Jay McShann and Step Buddy Anderson, Buddy Anderson, and Step Buddy Anderson and Piggy Minor, and others that knew Bird, and started going down to the Mutual Musicians Foundation. And then I received a crash course on Bird from Milton Morris at Milton's Tap Room over on Main Street, where he played nothing but the coolest sound, and he played a lot of Bird.
Yeah, a lot of Bird. Bird played a lot of Bird. Let's set the scene. Charlie Parker came out of Kansas City, which a lot was happening. Bird was born in 1920. By the time he was a teenager, I think I saw in your book, Chuck, he was a professional by the time he was 14. So what was it, Chuck, why don't you talk about what was the scene like in Kansas City in the mid-1930s?
Kansas City was a 24-hour town. During Prohibition, it was business as usual. The vice, graft, and corruption and lawlessness was fostered by the local government that was lorded over by a political machine headed up by one Tom Pendergast. Tom was in the liquor business, and he liked to gamble. So the city government really fostered this wild time. Mary Lou Williams, there's plenty of work for musicians. Mary Lou Williams recalled 50 clubs between 12th and 18th Street, and with featuring live music. And during the Great Depression, because there was work in Kansas City, musicians from the Southwest Territory came to Kansas City and joined the union, Local 627. So you had, over 300 musicians jazz musicians playing around town by the early 1930s. And Charlie Parker came up in that tradition, and he was really shaped by the late night jam sessions that started at midnight and went all the next day. And that's really where he learned his craft, how to go in and out of key, and how to play double time and all those tricks of the trade that musicians used to best each other in these legendary late-night cutting contests.
Yeah. Well, there's a famous story, I'd like you to retell it, about when Bird, Chuck, was getting his stuff together, and he played with Joe Jones, and Joe Jones was not particularly happy with what he heard. Could you share that story with us?
Well, Bird liked to hang out, like to roost, I always say, in the balcony above the bandstand at the Reno Club, where the reefer smoke was heavy from the band burning one down on the stage. And they had what they called a spook breakfast, is something that Basie remembered from Harlem. And the Count Basie band was playing there at the time. And it'd start on Sunday night and go all day Monday. Well, Charlie Parker had just picked up his horn and was studying at Lincoln High School, and he decided to sit in on one of the sessions, and he faltered while playing Honeysuckle Rose, and Joe Jones threw a cymbal at his feet and humiliated him in front of all the people in the club. So he retreated from 12th Street and went home and practiced for 12 to 14 hours a day. His neighbors, he reported how his neighbors really were complaining about his practicing all the time. And he mastered his horn, vowing that he would never get caught short again. And he never did.
Bobby, did you ever have a similar experience where you thought you had it together, you got on the bandstand, and you got some feedback that made you get back into the woodshed?
Absolutely, yes. And sometimes it was unspoken, just maybe sometimes just bearing witness and to someone else next to you or on the bandstand that was exhibiting more maturity, experience, and depth. If you're honest with yourself in this, you'll know. And I'm sure Bird, when he made that falter and got a little lost there, I'm sure he was really frustrated, and then to have it for all to see, I'm sure that put a big fire in his heart and soul, because every musician, as we're growing, especially jazz musicians, we come up against someone that has more experience and more language and what have you, and that drives you. It started in concert band. I was playing clarinet in the clarinet section, and we had our spring concert, and this other person stood up and played the clarinet solo with the band. That drove me crazy, 'cause I wanted to do that, So those type of things, they light a fire under you like no formal lesson or whatever can do.
Yeah, I guess we've all had those experiences that scare us and inspire us to get it together. Those of us who, are into creativity. So, Chuck, Bird got it together. What were some of the first gigs that he got when he really had his act together?
Well, the first gig he had was in July of 1935 at Lincoln Hall, at the corner of 18th and Vine, with a kid band led by Lawrence Keyes called the 12 Chords of Rhythm. And Lincoln Hall was a popular spot for Lincoln High School students. A lot of young people went there to check him out. And then he worked around town with Oliver Todd Band at a place called Frankie and Johnny's. And he wasn't very musically proficient at that time. Oliver Todd would be the first one to tell you. And they played, they played in the window, and it was so cold they all wore their overcoats. And finally, the leader, the owner of the club, asked them to fire Charlie because he was so unaccomplished. And his friend rode across town and begged the club owner to keep Charlie Parker on. Where he really took off was in 1937. He played a summer engagement with George G. Lee at Musser's Ozark Tavern, which is southeast of Kansas City, about 120 miles. And he came of age that summer. It was a sundown community at heart of Little Dixie in Missouri, and where African Americans ventured out after dark at their own peril. So he stayed on site, practiced his horn, and came back reportedly, according to Gene Ramey, a musically transformed musician. So, and then in 1938, in the spring of 1938, he really got his chops playing at a club called Lucille's Paradise, and it was on 18th Street, right next to the Kansas City Call, Kansas City's African American newspaper. And he shared the stage with Buster Smith, who was a former Blue Devil and also former member of the Basie band, and working side by side with Buster that spring, he really learned his craft from the master. there's a whole tradition. And later, of course, he worked with Harlan Leonard and Jay McShann around town, and he was a star soloist around town. The Kansas City Call often covered him, and in ads he was referred to as saxophonist supremist. And Little Charlie Parker is what they called him in those days.
Wow. Now, Bobby, let's talk a little bit about the state of the alto saxophone during that time. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Benny Carter and Johnny Hodges were at the so-called forefront of the alto sax. Am I right about that?
That's correct. Yes. That style, more arpeggiated style, outlining the chords up and down the horn, plus having a beautiful sound. They both were very lyrical, and so that was the dominant thing. And then when Bird came, his tone was still beautiful, but a little more steely, more focused, less vibrato, and also he had a linear approach. And what I mean by linear is note to note to note. Instead of boom, 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 they would be boom, 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 boom. So that's linear as opposed to arpeggiated. And his rhythmic sense was highly advanced. I think he explored rhythms more in the drums, and then the tempos, of course, and his compositions.
Yeah.
Which is already a tradition in jazz. You'd write an original composition over something like Honeysuckle, something like this, rhythm changes. I got rhythm. You blues, you'd write something melodic of your own over the top of it. That way you could garner some copyright royalties back then, which is that's another conversation for another day. But yeah.
Now, before Bird started doing that, writing his own melodies on top of the chord changes of existing standards, was anybody else doing that, Bobby?
Oh, sure. Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, all of them did that. Johnny Hodges, Duke, and the most exploited song form of all is blues. It's amazing when you hear how much Duke did over blues. I mean, that's probably the most exploited song form and set of changes. Next to I Got Rhythm, they used to call I Got Rhythm Sears and Roebuck's changes. If you remember Sears and Roebuck's, you could buy anything in the Sears catalog, and so they figure if you want to write an original song, you go to the Sears catalog and they'll send you those changes. The I Got Rhythm changes. So that's an early tradition. It goes back to Louis Armstrong. Jazz musicians were always creating melodies over things that were part of the American fabric, the songbook, you want to call it.
Yeah. So Charlie Parker was a pretty big deal in Kansas City, and he was just 18 or 19 years old. Chuck, when did he unfortunately get involved in heroin and all of that stuff? How old was he when that happened?
He was 16 when he first started using heroin. There were a lot of narcotics. Narcotics were readily available in Kansas City. He was smoking reefer when he was a teenager, and in Thanksgiving Day 1936, he was headed to a gig at Musser's Ozark Tavern with band leader George Wilkerson and his friend Ernest Daniels. And they were traveling caravan style, and his car, the car he was riding in, hit a slick spot on the road and flipped over, and it broke his ribs and his back, killed George Wilkerson, and threw Ernest Daniels 60 feet into a plowed field. It was a very severe wreck. And when he got back to Kansas City, the doctor gave him heroin because it was thought to be a safer alternative than morphine. And he developed a taste for heroin when he was 16 years old. I had an interview with a guy named Bud Calvert, who was a cab driver. And he was Bird's designated driver. He'd take Bird to an area in Kansas City now known as Slum, but Columbus Park was then known as the North End, and that's where Charlie would go score. It was just readily available. Before the cleanup, there was a $1 million narcotics operation operating in Kansas City. That's where he first got his taste.
Yeah, unfortunately, that stayed with him his whole life, and very negative aspect of it. I don't really want to get into that. I mean, we know about that.
No,
You
I
know.
want to say one thing.
Okay,
Can I
Bob.
say one thing?
Yeah.
It's like on top of that, it's the same thing today where doctors prescribe opioids. And but I think people have a lot more knowledge today, but they do it anyway. And I think that that sort of parallels, along with people's the musicians back then, Monk and Bud Powell and Bird, of course, and Fats Navarro. There was no mental medicine in terms of are they manic depressive, are they bipolar, or have these symptoms. You know what I mean? And so a lot of times as they grew up, and I'm sure they knew what it was doing, but to medicate themselves, all these things were there. The alcohol, and of course, the ever-loved reefer, which endures to this day. But those are two things that was against them as well, and facing Jim Crow. You see what I'm saying? So the doctors certainly thought he was doing the right thing. When Chuck mentioned that, I saw they used to sell heroin in medical dispensings, like legit. It was legit, just like cocaine was legit. They took that out of Coca-Cola. I mean, Roosevelt. They used to treat him. They used to think they would treat him with cocaine on swabs because he had sinus headaches, and it would clear up his nasal passages. But at the same time, he would get a little boost from it too. So I mean, this whole stuff is about discovery. So I mean, I don't want to get dragged down on that, because I'd rather talk about the person and his genius and how he overcame what he was doing. So
Yeah.
but what Chuck is saying is very important to know, that he just wasn't some deviant out there that wanted to get a fix. This started in a very legitimate manner.
Yeah.
And so I think that in those days there was no Betty Ford clinic.
Mm-hmm.
Guys were not being treated; they'd more likely be arrested. And also, he did have mental issues too, and as did Monk and Bud Powell, and they didn't get the treatment that they needed for that to help them cope with life, and so they were self-medicating with alcohol and narcotics, and it's unfortunate, but I think what we need to focus on, it's amazing that his triumph over adversity, growing up as an African American in America in the 1940s, being a jazz musician, suffering from depression and other maladies, and being a heroin addict, and despite all that, he triumphed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Before we leave this particular area, I just want to talk about the racial situation in Kansas City. You talked about the vibrant scene. Did whites and blacks mix back then, Chuck, or was it segregated?
Well, Kansas City was the first stop outside the Deep South, and that's how that really created 18th and Vine. And there was segregation. There was segregation in Kansas City up until the 1960s. It wasn't quite as Jim Crow as down south, though. I mean, for example, you had Local 627, which was the African American union, and you had 34, which was the white union. And you did have, and so there was racial segregation, but in the clubs on 12th Street, you did have what they call black and tan clubs. African Americans and whites both attended the Reno Club. And there were other clubs on 12th Street too. Often, though, it would be a situation where maybe the African Americans are sitting on the floor and the whites are sitting up in the balcony. So Kansas City was a racist place, and there was segregation, but it wasn't as bad as Mississippi. And that's why a lot of musicians came here.
Yeah, well, there's a story in your book about when Bird and Diz were playing with Earl Hines' band, and Dizzy, the audience, you couldn't mix with the audience. The black musicians played these white dances, and there was one time where Dizzy was alone, and he was about to be attacked, and Bird stepped up and rescued him. Could you share that with us, Chuck?
Well, they were traveling down south with Earl Father Hines, and this cracker came up and started insulting Gillespie, called him boy and throwing a nickel, done to play a tune for him, because Gillespie was on stage at playing the piano. And after the gig, Gillespie used the white-only restroom because there was nobody there, and when he came out, he saw a shadow behind him, and this guy hit Dizzy over the head with a champagne bottle and bounced off his head. And Parker intervened and called this guy a cur and said, "You attacked my friend, you cur." And the guy didn't quite know what to think about it. It was this black guy calling him a cur in a white club. And so he came to his rescue. But that's one of the things that about traveling down south with Earl Father Hines. They faced prejudice at every corner. When Bird was traveling with Jay McShann down south, he and Walter Brown were smoking cigarettes on a front porch where they were staying in the rooming house because there were no hotels for them. And two cops pulled him off the porch and beat he and Walter Brown so bad, Gene Ramey said you could hang hats on the knots in their head. And as a result, he wrote a song called What Christ Loved. Later, he would make it into Yardbird Suite, which is one of his more joyous compositions. So he took really a tragedy and turned it into a triumph, but with this composition.
Yeah, well, sadly, in many ways, the situation has really not changed that much.
No.
This whole thing that's happening now, I mean, just every day, the treatment of African Americans by the militarized police in the United States is not that much different than the treatment that musicians traveling in the South got during that period.
I tell you, the situation is just as unpredictable now as it was then for black men, especially, and black women as well. But it's just as unpredictable, and I feel precarious and sometimes dangerous because things can change in an instant. Driving down the street on a beautiful sunny day, and next thing you know, going over to your cousin's house on a Sunday or whatever, and next thing you know, and we've watched plenty of documentation of those times that were more blatant, and that's probably only the tip of the iceberg because nobody had cell phones back then, and so it's not like it's in a way more, it's just being captured more now. Yeah. And I think that's that documentation, picture is worth 1,000 words, and when you see it on videotape, it's kind of hard to say that didn't happen. So those guys were extremely brave. Bird, that's why I always say, like Chuck says, it's triumph over adversity. When I hear his sound, when he played, that always that was his horn was his sanctuary, and the bandstand was his altar with all of those guys, and it could leave all the troubles of Jim Crow and whatever they went through that day and come together on a bandstand and make this holy music that just was coming from a place where no one had ever been, and it's still so powerful today. People got to remember, when you listen to those what they call old records, those were young people on those records. You know, just like y'all people are young today. Those were young folks doing all that stuff, like the civil rights. Those were young people. You know, so you know, they were rebel rousers, as they want to call them. You know, and that music was. You know, they had the older ones in front of them. Some loved them and some embraced them. Some of them snubbed them and tried to put them down. So, Bird, you know, was a young man, died at 34. My gosh, you know, that's the whole thing that I had to grasp my head around with Clifford Brown and them guys. And they looked so mature. And they carried themselves as grown men. You know, even Martin, you look at those pictures, you know, hard to believe he was in his 20s. And Bird, you know, so young, but yet so brave and so committed to what they had to say, and they weren't wasting any time. You know, with Bird, it wasn't about imitation. All them guys, you know, you had to find your own voice and be yourself. You didn't have time to imitate anybody. You know, there really wasn't anybody that imitated anybody. The best I could think of off the top of my head is Paul Quinichette. You know, he was called the vice pres because everything that when Lester Young put something out, Paul Quinichette would be on it. You know, but you know, that's an exception to the rule. And Bird represented that individuality and that courage, you know, to put it out there.
Absolutely. Let's step back for a second, Chuck. When did Bird go to New York and why?
He went to New York with Jay McShann Band, and the Jay McShann. Well, there had been a cleanup in Kansas City, a civic cleanup, and jobs for musicians dried up, and also narcotics was not available locally anymore. And Jay McShann had a hit record recorded at 1941, April 41, of Hootie Blues, and that's the first record that really made people aware of Bird's genius. And they played that summer at Fairyland Park and then left for New York City, worked their way north, and east or rather, and they arrived in New York City, I believe it was February the 13th, and played at the Savoy Ballroom. And that date could be wrong, but in early 42, they opened at the Savoy Ballroom. And opposite Lucky Millinder, and that night they defeated Lucky Millinder in a battle of the bands, and they became regular at the Savoy Ballroom. And there were broadcasts nightly from the Savoy Ballroom, so Bird's solos were going out all over the country. And musicians would flock around the bandstand just to check out Bird. And that's really where he first arrived and first stayed in New York City. That always had been the goal for Kansas City musicians, going back to Benny Moten and also Andy Kirk. You had a hit record, and that hit record carried you to New York City, where the entertainment industry was at that time. It wasn't in Hollywood then. And so if you're going to make it, you go to New York, right, Bobby?
Yes, right.
You know, that's where he first arrived in New York. And of course, New York's a very cosmopolitan place. It's not nearly as racist as Kansas City, although every place was racist in America at that time. And there's lots of work for him too. Very exciting place to be. It's a natural move for him.
Yeah. So he gets to New York. He starts to turn more heads. When did he start hanging out with Dizzy and Minton's Playhouse? And when did that start to happen?
Dizzy and Bird first met in July of 1940. Dizzy was in town with Cab Calloway's band playing at Fairyland Park where the McShann Band played. And Step Buddy Anderson dug, in his own words, he dug Diz, and he told Diz about this alto player, and he wanted to introduce him to Charlie. And he arranged for a visit in front of the old Kentucky Barbecue at 19th and Vine, and Bird didn't show up that first day, but they hooked up the next day, and they walked around the corner to local 627, and Bird and Step Buddy, who also had advanced ideas, played for Dizzy. Dizzy didn't play for them. And in his autobiography, Dizzy talks about how he was still playing like Roy Eldridge, but Bird had already been playing bebop in Kansas City, and that's where they first, hooked up. And then when the McShann band started playing at the Savoy Ballroom, Dizzy would show up and sit in with the band, and he wanted to join the band, but Jay couldn't afford to bring him into the band. And he also already had a star soloist. So, the New York, of course, the Minton's, Clark Monroe's Uptown House, these late night jam sessions. That's where they really hooked up with other modernists too. But there were other musicians at the time like Bud Powell, Kenny Clark, Charlie Christian were moving in the same direction, but it would be Bird and Gillespie that would really pioneer bebop and then popularize it together.
Yeah. Now, Bobby, the music scene at the time, swing music was basically the standard at that time. All of a sudden, Bird and Diz and Kenny Clark and Monk, they're playing something new. Initially, they met with a certain amount of resistance, just like Coltrane did in the early 60s when some critics called him anti-jazz. What was it about bebop, Bobby, that was so different than what was happening at the time?
Swing music had two components. First of all, the beauty of the music, and also some soloists. But if you look at two components, the bigger components was the effect it had on the body and the lower extremities. Makes you want to go like this. And the tempos were such that the gigs that the swing era people played were always for dancers. It was a popular music. It's what the young people dance to. And again, young people have to remember singing that swing dance music, a bunch of old folks get up and dance because they were young when it came out. See? So it was a young thing, and it was popular. Duke Ellington and all the great bands, the Count Basie and, Benny Goodman, whatever. Fletcher Henderson, they all played for dances. It was about dancing, and they would hear the music, but it was mainly about dancing. Bebop sped up the tempo. The harmonies got reworked. It was still swinging, but the two elements got switched. You still felt the swing in your body, they say, but their emphasis was on the ears. They went from the ears to the heart, and so it was more for listening. They made you listen. They would, if you were a musician or someone in the audience, your first reaction was from the ears. Like, what the heck are they doing? And I like that, or I don't like that, but it wasn't the first thing out of your body was, hey, let me get on the dance floor to this music, see? So it was music for listening. And I don't want to mistake that for being cerebral, although it is cerebral. It is a science. Bebop is the science of modern music. But it's still, maybe the tempos and the intricacies, the rhythms, a little more complex, playing across the bar lines, this tempo against that tempo, and it was you had to listen, and it affected you that way.
And from a non-musical perspective, was it harder to play bebop because of the complexities of the harmonics, Bobby? Yes,
it was, and it also required more practice. Because another characteristic of swing era soloists, say for instance like Illinois Jacquet, probably the most famous example I can give is when he had his hit on Flying Home. These cats, when they would play live, they would play that same solo every time they played, no matter where they were. Because the listeners, it was a hit, and it was pop music. And so these soloists that were famous soloists during that era, they played the same solo that they recorded live. And so that really didn't require much probing and practicing and tweaking and, hey, I'm tired of doing that solo tonight. I'm going to just go for it. They were much more regimented and disciplined in their approach. So their skill level, and even though they were all virtuosos in their own right and masters, but the skill level and the possibilities of the instrument were not really being encouraged throughout the community. Once you got your hit, you got your solo, and you're known for that. But then bebop came along, and every night was different. You couldn't hear the same arrangement twice, and they were stretching. If they did a record, you come to the gig thinking to hear what Bird and them recorded on the record, you're going to be disappointed because they'd have taken the music somewhere else by then. So the music started to get this momentum driven by these young men and women and striving and digging in deeper and and moving forward. It was uncomfortable for a lot of folks in the swing era. It was very uncomfortable for them because you get to a certain level, you got it, you're done.
Yeah. Now, Chuck, in addition to the musical changes, there was something of a lifestyle of the beboppers. They'd wear colorful berets, and they talked in a different kind of language, kind of like hip hop was to do, like half a century later. So, Chuck, could you talk about the bebop culture for a sec?
Well, Charlie Parker had a large following, and not only did he inspire musicians that followed, but also artists of all stripe, poets, painters, writers, and kind of the counterculture of the 1940s and the 1950s. The beatniks loved Charlie Parker. Jack Kerouac was a big fan of Charlie Parker, and they developed what we call a language of their own, like Lester Young. And Dizzy Gillespie really was criticized for clowning on stage, for wearing berets, and he was the one that kind of put that forward. Ironically, Dizzy was criticized for his outrageous performances on stage, outrageous stage presence, clowning and dancing and all that stuff. Charlie Parker was very reserved on stage. Off stage, Charlie Parker had a very crazy life. Off stage, Dizzy Gillespie had a very stable life. So they were two different kind of cats. But there was that culture that followed them and developed their own language, their own lifestyle. And of course, in the post-World War II period, America's undergoing a lot of changes. You have questioning authority. A lot of Americans have been to Europe and been exposed to different lifestyles. So you have this growing kind of counterculture in America, and bebop spoke to them.
Absolutely, and it spoke to people all over the planet. When the Bird did get to Europe, but when he got to Sweden and France, he was lionized. I mean, and that holds true to this day. As the jazz video guy, I'm always looking for interesting content to post, and thank God for European and Japanese TV stations and networks who documented so much of this music when musicians couldn't get it. I mean, you could list on one hand the number of performances most musicians had on network TV during that period. So thank you, Europe. Bobby, what was it, do you think, about Bird that made him so exciting for young musicians and wanted to follow him, particularly his playing?
Number one, I think you have to be awestruck by his virtuosity and the effortlessness and how easy he made it look. That alone is pretty scary, as you're trying to climb the ladder of skill. And when you see someone doing what you only could dream of or haven't dreamt of, that's pretty shocking to the soul. I heard that a lot of musicians they just stopped playing. You know, I don't know if that story is true about Louis Jordan. One night, Chuck, I don't know. They got that scene where he threw his horn in the river. At first, that had that composite character, but I'm sure Bird made a lot of people come to a realization real quick, and it separated people who were just doing it for fun as people who had to make a decision. Man, I'm gonna go after this. I'm gonna learn. I'm gonna study. I'm gonna get up under them. I'm gonna ask questions. I'm gonna hang out with musicians better than me. So he raised the bar so high. That was scary. And then his sound. You know, talking to Charles McPherson, he said he heard Bird, and he said he heard all the other great alto players. He said they were good. They were very good. But he said none of them had that sound that Bird had, and the clearness and it's like it was bullets. He said, you know, just I could only imagine. You know, I have dreams at night about wanting to hear Bird, man. You know, and he was a phenomenon. I can't imagine, you know, because like I say, he raised the bar on the level of musicianship and technical skill on every instrument, and it still carries forward to this day.
Absolutely, definitely. You know, as Bobby knows, Walter Bishop Jr. was a close friend of mine, and he talked a lot about Bird, obviously. And one thing that he noted about Bird really cared about people. And when when they would tour, when they go to these different cities, musicians wanted to sit in, and Bird, you know, a lot of times let them sit in, even though they didn't come close to what Bird was doing. He made it a point to always having a good word about someone. He'd say to a cat, "Well, gee, man, your tone is beautiful," or whatever, and that elevated the musicians who had interactions with him because Bird was the word. Bird said something about you, it made them feel good. Do you think, Chuck, that Bird? Would you agree that he was someone who really cared about people?
Yeah, he was interested in everybody, and he, by all reports, he treated everybody equally. You know, he came up in Kansas City, and there's a long tradition of older musicians passing the tradition on to younger musicians. Bobby continues that today at the Conservatory of Music at UMKC. So he learned his craft watching Lester Young and being mentored by Buster Smith, and then he gave it back too. He mentored younger musicians. Think about Clifford Brown, his relationship with Clifford Brown. He spoke very highly of Chet Baker, Hampton Hawes, Frank Morgan. You know, when he was in Los Angeles in 1947, he mentored all the young musicians there at jam sessions, and he was a very kind individual, and he had empathy for people. And I think that he had a way of communicating one-on-one with people that you know, when you read Robert Reisner's book on Bird with all the interviews, it's like there's 88 different Charlie Parkers there, because everybody had a one-on-one experience with him and a story about Bird because he related to people so well.
You know, I must have seen that clip probably hundreds of times, and yet every time I see it, it kind of blows my mind because it sounds so contemporary. It sounds like it was recorded yesterday. Would you agree, Bobby?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I remember the first time I saw it, I just was mesmerized, you know. And one thing I noticed is, first of all, I couldn't see his fingers really moving. And also, every time he'd blow, that little bow tie would go. It'd go up and down with every phrase. Ooh, ooh. You know, I was like, oh boy, he's putting some air through that horn. You know, besides what he was playing, I mean, forget about it. I mean, he just, it's like, my God, what a craft that solo was. I mean, just everything is just so complete, you know. Yeah. I wish there was more. I just wish there was more.
Yeah, we all do, definitely. Chuck, why do you think Bird and Diz work so well together?
Well, they came together in one heartbeat. I think that they intuitively knew what the other was going to play, and they were like red beans and rice, and they would get together after hours, and when they played with Earl Father Hines and jam in clubs and in hotel rooms, and they just played together a lot. And that's why they were so close. And they played together not only on the bandstand but off the bandstand. They were inseparable musically. But professionally, they were different, so that kind of led to their split.
Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about Bird's recordings. I was reading your book yesterday. You mentioned how at some point Norman Granz kind of took control over what Bird was recording, Chuck. And that might have hindered him in some way. For example, you have in your book how Roy Haynes acknowledges that for whatever reason Norman Granz didn't want to hire him. Therefore, Buddy Rich ended up being on a number of Verve recordings that Norman Granz produced. Do you think in some ways Norman Granz held Bird back, Chuck?
Well, he held him back, I think, creatively, but he also advanced his career with his appearance at Jazz Philharmonic. And the fact that he recorded for the Verve label, which paid him good royalties, and he sold a lot more records with Norman Granz. But Roy Haynes was very upset because he wouldn't let him use his normal quintet. He would want to populate it with other artists that really, they were great musicians, but they weren't in pocket with Bird. And Bird, I think Bird's career took a change there. What really caused, ironically, his string recordings were the most successful recordings that he did. But cost him his quintet, cost him his group, because when he'd go out on the road and play with these string sections or play in Birdland, Red Rodney wouldn't have a gig. And so his band drifted off one by one so they can make a living. And that forced Bird, when he toured, to go out as a solo, and he was playing with a lot of musicians and soloists and rhythm sections that were just not up to his standards. And that was a problem for him later in his career.
Sorry, Chuck. Yeah, that was the beginning of this all-star band's mess. I shouldn't say mess, but this whole concept of the all-star band, where the promoter picks his quote-unquote dream band, because Art Blakey had told me about how over the years they wanted him to ditch the Jazz Messengers and come on and just do this all-star thing. You make more money, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and Art was there, and so, this was an old story to him, and he held on to the Jazz Messengers, because he just believed in that group thing. And the only time he did it was the the Jazz Giants, at Monk and Sonny Stitt, Al McKibben. That was the beginning of this whole concept. Brett and Chuck, we've seen pretty much our whole life, this whole all-star concept. CTI did it, and they had all the artists touring together with this super band, the super band. What was that? That cigarette company.
Philip Morris.
Philip Morris. All these type of things. They really, gave musicians a really nice payday and some high visibility. But the whole thing of an organized unit kind of got hurt really bad. And I was lucky enough to hear stories from Art Blakey and folks that were around him, that told these stories about Bird, But anyway, that's in terms of hurting his creativity. Of course, when you're playing with people that are unfamiliar with your moves, like Chuck was saying, beans and rice, I can anticipate you. That's gone. And what's left is just a high level of musicianship and respect, which is great. But there's nothing like a unit.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm sure you guys have seen those pictures of Bird, and John Coltrane is in the background, and he's like awestruck. And
Yeah.
Bobby, what are your thoughts on how Bird influenced Train, and then Train took it someplace else?
Oh yeah, that picture was from a gig that Jimmy Heath had. That was Jimmy Heath's big band, and he had brought Bird down there, and Train was in the band. That was in Philadelphia, and I think in some of the pictures you can actually see Jimmy out in front of the band. I don't know. I kind of forgot your question.
Okay, without Bird, there would be no Train, right?
Oh, there you go. Yeah, without Bird, there would be no Train. There would be none of us, really. It wouldn't be any of us. He just. I'm like a boomerang. I got two stops, Bird and Prez. You know, and I'm like, whenever I go out, it's like somebody throws me out, and I'll go out like a boomerang, and I'll hang out, and I'll check out Train and Dexter and everybody else and Wayne Shorter. But the boomerang always comes back home, you know, to Bird, you know. So that's how I look at it, you know. You can go out and come back, and you're going to come right back to Bird, and then right next to him is the Prez, man. Because those guys are about individuality and innovation. So everything comes from them, really. And, you know, the story people don't really talk about as much as his photographic memory. He had a photographic memory. And Art told me that when he left the Eckstein band, they brought in Sonny Stitt to play lead alto.
Yeah.
So he opened the lead alto book. The music in the book was still like it had never touched. And Bird had memorized the whole book. That's the first thing. So he had looked at it one time and put the music back. So all the music was still brand new. And so Sonny Stitt pulled out the music, and it's still crisp. So Sonny Stitt starts to read the music. And then Dizzy, musical director, you know, anyway.
Eckstein.
Eckstein, excuse me. He stops the band and goes, Stitt, you're not reading the part, man. Let's do it again. He plays it. Stitt, I'm not hearing the whole part. You're leaving something out. So Dizzy goes over and looks at the music, and he goes, well, I'll be doggone. Bird was adding notes to the parts, and they had gotten used to hearing Bird play the parts. So he had already absorbed the parts and started adding notes, you know. So that's another thing, you know. And another one, I don't want to keep you, but Art Blakey told me this. He said one time after the gig, he's playing with Bird, and him and Dizzy and some of the cats, they wanted to go out and chase some women, you know, and get into some trouble, you know. And Bird called him over and said, Arthur, come here. He goes, yes, Bird, what? So where are you going? Oh, we're gonna go out and we're gonna get some women, you know. Arthur, you know, he brought him up to the hotel room, and Bird had a towel around his head and was on the bed playing saxophone, and he had Art playing drums on the phone book, you know, and Dizzy there with his mute, and they were in the hotel room. He made him practice and play all night long, and he said, Arthur, the music first, then everything else will come. So those are stories that are close to me, you know. The Bird, you know, was amazing.
Yeah. Chuck, what is Kansas City doing to celebrate Bird's birthday?
Well, there's been a lot going on here locally. They all kicked off on July the 16th with an exhibit, Saxophone Supreme, the life and music of Charlie Parker in the Changing Gallery at the American Jazz Museum, and I co-curated that with Jerry Sanders, the director of collections at American Jazz Museum. There's 12 panels, lots of memorabilia and artifacts in there. It's a whole room full of Bird. And also there's been a lot of club dates, people playing in clubs. The clubs are beginning to open again. Tonight there's a Well, they had a sunrise ceremony this morning. They've had a boot camp with Chris Burnett. So the local celebration is under the umbrella of Kansas City Jazz Alive. It's called Spotlight Charlie Parker. And we all came together, and there's been something going on virtually every day. And then it caps off tonight with, Bobby's playing today at 5 o'clock at the American Jazz Museum. And then tonight there's a documentary called Bird Not Out of Nowhere being broadcast on KCPT, and it features Bobby and Logan Richardson, Lonnie McFadden, and me talking about Bird, and then them playing Bird's music. And it's a real celebration of Bird. It's been a month-long celebration. What else am I missing there, Bobby? I know I'm missing something.
Oh, I don't. It's so much. Did you do your tour this year?
No, their jazz tour is supposed to be this morning, but it rained, so we're doing jazz tours,
okay.
walking tours of 18th and Vine tomorrow morning, Sunday morning, and places where Charlie Parker worked and played in the 18th and Vine area. There's been lots of articles written about Bird in local press, and there's been quite a celebration here locally. And it's been a challenge because of COVID-19.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Everything's a challenge now. Bobby, don't you have a new record with a couple of stellar alto players? Is that a tribute to Bird?
Yeah, that came out right after his 99th birthday. About a year. Yeah, he had just turned 99, or was going to. Anyway, it was Gary Barth and Vincent Herring. It's Vincent's project, actually. He called me and me and Gary to be a part of it. And that was a lot of fun. It was recorded live at Smoke in New York over 4 nights, and it did real well. It's a really good, proud part of that. I was able to get an original composition on there in the tradition of writing a new melody over some well-known changes. I wrote a melody off of Confirmation titled Birdish. So, right now, today, we were scheduled to be in New York and getting ready to do the Charlie Parker Festival, as you know, every year in New York with the saxophones, And the last night was supposed to be Buffalo. I say we're scheduled, but there was a lot of things on the table this year, which the good thing is he's just turning 100, so we got the hall next year to do it too. So it's pretty cool, Now,
Chuck, in addition to your writing, don't you do a radio show?
Yeah, I do a radio show called The Fish Fry, the finest in blues, soul, rhythm and blues, jump and jive, Zydeco. Friday and Saturday nights from 8 until midnight on public radio station KCUR 89.3 on your FM dial. Also streamed at kcur.org. I have a good time. I've been doing that for 35 years come October. One of the things I'm really excited about with this bird celebration is my book has been translated and published in Japan. So I'm real happy about that. And Yoko Takamura has been keeping me updated as to where it's being offered in Japan, where it's available in Japan. It's available in all the disc stores and also all the bookstores. So I'm real happy about that.
Bobby, a final question for you. To someone who's new to Bird, which recordings would you recommend they listen to?
Well, without question, I would say start with Bird with Strings. Bird with Strings, and one of his big band recordings. I like the one called South of the Border with Machito. I think those two, if they whet your taste for Bird, then there's a plethora of small group recordings that you can get into quintets and quartets and but I would recommend Bird with Strings definitely as number one.
Yeah. Well, when I was getting into Bird, one of my first was Jazz at Massey Hall. As we're closing out here, Chuck, can you say something about how that album was actually done?
Well, there was a concert booked by the Jazz Society in Canada, in Toronto at Massey Hall, and Bird. It was a reunion of sort with Bird and Dizzy Gillespie, and of course Bud Powell was there, and Charles Mingus. And it wasn't supposed to be recorded, but Mingus recorded it. And then he issued it on his debut label. And that evening, Dizzy and Bird tried to outplay each other all night long. This is one of these legendary concerts. And fortunately, it was recorded by our man Charles Mingus. And he issued it originally as a 10-inch LP, and then later it was issued as a 12-inch LP. And it's both of them at the top of their game, and the whole band's at the top of the game, actually.
But in the original recording, the bass was not really picked up very well. What did Mingus do about that?
Mingus went in and overdubbed his bass line on it. Mingus was not going to be denied.
Yeah. And what should have been a sold-out concert really wasn't. What happened to take people's attention away from the concert, Chuck?
There was a fight that night, and I can't remember the two fighters, but it was a very famous fight that evening. So, in fact, Dizzy and Bird went across the street to the tavern on the break to watch the fight. Everybody watched it.
Yeah. Well, we've burned through an hour here, and we've just barely scratched the surface of one of the most remarkable musicians who ever lived, and one of the most unique people. Bird lives. Bird is still the word. It's 100 years after his birth, and new people are listening, and those of us who've been around are still amazed by the man Charlie Parker. So, Bobby Watson, final words.
We're just scratching the surface of Charlie Parker's genius, because Bird himself said that he was just scratching the surface. So, we have a long way to go, and we'll be studying him for years and decades to come. And this is beautiful that at 100 years, we're just seeing what's going on.
Okay. And Chuck, your final words about Bird.
Well, I think what I'm encouraged by is Bird is getting his flowers for his centennial. Articles today in the New York Times, Washington Post, a lot being written about him here, and I think we're just really beginning to understand what a genius he was and how much he influenced musicians that followed and the artists that followed, and how it resonates still today with hip-hop artists sampling Charlie Parker. Bird Lives was written, of course, after his passing, but it still resonates today. That's what I'll say. Bird lives.
Bird lives.
Bird lives, absolutely. Thanks for joining us, and please stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you next week for a couple more shows from Jazz Video Guy Live. Next Friday, a show about Brazilian jazz, one of my favorites, and next Saturday we're going to have Denny Zeitlin, who's a pianist who does a lot of solo stuff. We're going to get into that. So please stay healthy, stay safe, and keep listening to Bird.